My name is Lena Carter. I'm 34 years old, and 8 months ago, I won a wrongful termination case for a single mother of three that every other attorney in Chicago had turned down because the defendant was a Fortune 500 company with a legal department the size of a small law firm. I'm telling you that because I need you to understand what I was professionally before I tell you what my family decided I was personally. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Cream envelope, heavy cardstock, the specific weight of something that has been designed to communicate importance before it's even opened. My parents' return address in the upper left corner, the Evanston house, the one with the oak trees in the front yard that I'd climbed as a child before I understood that the house they represented was not the same house I actually lived inside. I stood at my kitchen counter with Oliver on my hip, 3 months old, warm and solid, and smelling like the specific clean sweetness of a baby who has just had a bath, and I opened the envelope with the particular careful attention of someone who has learned to read documents for what they don't say as much as what they do. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Carter request the pleasure of your company at a celebration of 40 years of marriage formal. Correct. My name typed on the inner envelope in the clean serif font my mother used for correspondence, she considered official. I read it twice. Then I looked at Oliver, who was examining my collar with the focused intensity he brought to all textured surfaces, and I felt the specific, complicated weight of being included by people who had spent the better part of 7 years making their version of exclusion perfectly clear. "We've been invited to a party," I told him. He grabbed my collar. He was not concerned. Let me tell you about the night Oliver was born, because the invitation makes no sense without it. It was a February night, 14 hours of labor in a hospital room at Northwestern Memorial, with a nurse named Diane who held my hand during the hard contractions, and a resident named Dr. Park who talked me through the final hour with the specific steady competence of someone who understood that words were a clinical tool and used them accordingly. My mother's phone went to voicemail 4 times. My father's went to voicemail twice and then stopped ringing, which meant he'd seen the screen and declined. My sister Vanessa, when I reached her on the 3rd attempt, said she was at dinner and would call me back. She called back 11 days later. She'd seen photos on my social media, she said. Oliver was adorable. We should get together sometime. Diane the nurse stayed 2 hours past her shift end. She brought me ice chips and adjusted my pillows, and at one point, when the labor was at its worst and the room felt very large and very empty, she put her hand on my arm and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. I have thought about Diane many times since, about the specific quality of a stranger choosing to stay when the people who were supposed to be there had chosen not to. That's the arithmetic I was running when I stood at my kitchen counter with the cream envelope and my 3-month-old son and the 40 years of marriage invitation that had arrived 7 years into my parents' selective availability. If you've ever been left alone in a room that should have had people in it and then received a formal invitation from those same people when the optics required your presence, drop a comment, because the specific combination of those 2 experiences produces a clarity that nothing else quite replicates. I need to tell you about Vanessa, because without Vanessa, the family arithmetic doesn't add up correctly. Vanessa Carter, at 31, was the version of a daughter my parents had always been building toward, the one who looked right in photographs, who said the right things at the right events, who had constructed a professional and social life that served as a continuous advertisement for the family that produced her. She ran a boutique event planning business that my parents had seed funded at 24, that operated out of a River North office. My father's business connections had helped her lease below market rate, and that had accumulated a client list built substantially on introductions my parents had facilitated through their social network. She was also, in the specific vocabulary of the family's internal economy, the one whose calls got answered. I understood this not from a single defining moment, but from the accumulated evidence of 3 decades of small, documentable differences. whose recital got both parents present and whose got one, whose college tuition was fully funded and whose required loans that took 9 years to pay down, whose pregnancy announcement produced dinner reservations at a nice restaurant, and whose produced a 2-day silence followed by my mother saying, in the specific careful tone she used when she was managing her presentation of disappointment, "We just wish the circumstances were different, Lena." The circumstances being that Oliver's father had left 8 weeks into the pregnancy, and I had decided, with the particular, grounded clarity of a lawyer who has spent years helping other people navigate exactly this decision, that I was keeping my son regardless of what anyone else's circumstances preference was. That decision had cost me the version of my parents that answered phones. Until the invitation arrived, apparently, and the 40th anniversary required a complete family portrait. The Evanston venue was a restored estate on the North Shore that my mother had rented for the occasion, the kind of property that communicates its price through understatement. Clean architectural lines, professional landscaping, the specific quiet of a space that knows it doesn't need to announce itself. I arrived with Oliver in his carrier, in a dress I'd bought for the occasion, with the professional assessment of a lawyer choosing courtroom attire, appropriate, composed, communicating nothing I didn't intend to communicate. My mother met me at the entrance. She looked at Oliver first. Not at me, at Oliver, with the specific evaluative attention of a woman deciding how she felt about something before she committed to feeling it publicly. Then she looked at me with the warmth she deployed for social occasions, genuine enough in its surface texture to function, thin enough underneath that I'd learned to stop testing its depth. "You came," she said. "Not, I'm glad you're here. Not, it's good to see you. You came." The acknowledgement of a variable that had shown up as predicted. "I came," I said. She kissed Oliver's forehead. Quickly, correctly, the gesture of a woman performing grandmother for the room rather than feeling it for the child, and steered me toward the main hall with the specific directional pressure of a hostess managing traffic flow. The main hall was hung with photographs. This is the detail I want you to hold, because it's the detail that reorganized everything else about the evening. 40 years of photographs. The specific, curatorial presentation of a marriage and a family across time. Anniversary portraits, holiday gatherings, vacations, milestones. My parents had clearly worked with someone to organize and display them, because the arrangement had the intentional quality of a professional narrative rather than a personal one. I walked the length of the display with Oliver drowsing against my chest, and I looked at 40 years of my family's documented history, and I performed, silently and with the trained composure of someone who has spent years keeping their face still in difficult rooms, the specific accounting that the display required. Vanessa at every age. Vanessa at Christmas, at graduations, at the beach house in Michigan, at her business launch event, at family dinners I had sometimes also attended. 40 years of photographs, my name on the invitation, and in the entire curated display of my family's history, not one image that included me, not one. I stood in front of the display for a moment that was probably 15 seconds and felt the specific, structural clarity of a thing that has been partially understood for a long time becoming completely understood all at once. Not the emotional content of it. I had processed the emotional content of my family's accounting system across 34 years, and I was not surprised by new evidence of its consistency. The structural clarity. The understanding that the invitation had not been an inclusion. It had been a casting call. They needed bodies to fill a room for wealthy guests and business partners, and I was a body with the right last name, and the calculus had been exactly that simple. Oliver made a small sound against my chest. I put my hand on his back and felt his breathing. Steady, slow, the specific, trustworthy rhythm of a person who has not yet learned to perform their comfort for other people's benefit. I turned from the photographs. Across the room, my father was shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize. business associate from the posture and the specific quality of their interaction. My mother was at the center of a cluster of women, silver-haired and composed, the performance running at full capacity. Vanessa was near the bar in a dress that had been selected with the specific intentionality of someone who understood that every event was also a presentation. She looked up and saw me, and did the thing her face always did when it registered my presence. A micro-adjustment, a brief recalibration, the expression of a person filing an unexpected variable. She raised her glass. I nodded. An elderly man was making his way toward me from the far side of the room, 70-something, deliberate in his movement, with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who has somewhere to be and is not concerned about the pace of getting there. He was looking at me with the direct, purposeful attention of someone who has identified a specific person in a room and is navigating toward them with intention. He had a sealed envelope in his hand. I watched him cross the room, and I felt, not premonition, I don't deal in premonition, I deal in evidence. I felt the specific professional alertness of a lawyer who has just registered that a document is about to be delivered and that the delivery is not incidental. He stopped in front of me. He looked at Oliver briefly, with the soft recognition of a man who has known grief and knows what it looks like in a new life. Then he looked at me. "Lena Carter," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "My name is Harold Benson. I was your grandmother's attorney for 23 years. He held out the envelope. "She asked me to find you. I've been looking for the right moment for 2 years. I think this is it." The envelope was sealed with the specific finality of something that had been waiting a long time to be opened. I took it with the hand that wasn't supporting Oliver's back. I looked at it. Cream paper, my name in my grandmother's handwriting, the specific, careful lettering of a woman who had always written as though the words mattered enough to form correctly. Across the room, my mother laughed at something someone had said, the social laugh, the performance laugh. The photographs lined the wall behind me, 40 years of a family that had somehow managed to document itself without including me. Harold Benson looked at me steadily. "She loved you very much," he said. "She wanted to make sure you knew that. And she wanted to make sure you had what she left you." I looked at him. "What do you mean, what she left me?" His expression did something complicated and specific. The expression of a man who has been carrying information about a wrong for 2 years and is relieved, finally, to be placing it in the hands it was meant for. "Your grandmother left you a substantial inheritance," he said quietly. "You never received it. There's a reason for that. It's documented, and I think you're going to want to sit down." Oliver breathed against my chest, steady, trustworthy. The room moved around us, glasses, laughter, the performance of a family celebrating 40 years of something it was calling love. I held my grandmother's letter. I did not sit down. I was a lawyer. I had spent 10 years learning to stand still in rooms while significant information arrived, to keep my face neutral and my mind running and my hands completely, professionally steady. I kept my hands steady. I started counting. I found a chair in a small anteroom off the main hall, a sitting room that had been set up for coat storage and wasn't being used for anything else, which made it the only space in the building that wasn't performing something. I sat down. Harold Benson sat across from me in the other chair, with the particular settled patience of a man who has been waiting 2 years for this conversation and is not going to rush it now that it's arrived. Oliver was asleep against my chest. The specific total sleep of a 3-month-old who has made his assessment of the environment and found it sufficient for unconsciousness. His weight was grounding in the way that only a sleeping child's weight is grounding, solid, trusting, the physical evidence of a person who has decided you are safe, without running any of the calculations that adults run before they make that decision. I looked at the envelope in my hands. My grandmother's handwriting on the front. Margaret Carter, who had died 2 years ago at 81 in the same house she'd lived in for 53 years, who had made biscuits on Sunday mornings and kept a garden that she approached with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that growing things required consistency rather than inspiration, and who had looked at me across tables and kitchen counters and hospital waiting rooms with a quality of attention that I had spent my whole life understanding as the cleanest form of being seen I had access to. She had written my name on this envelope. She had sealed it. She had given it to Harold Benson with instructions to find me. Someone had made sure I didn't receive it for 2 years. I broke the seal. The letter was 4 pages. Handwritten, front and back, on the cream stationery my grandmother had kept in the top drawer of her writing desk for as long as I could remember. The drawer that also contained a spare pen, a small dictionary, and a photograph of me at 7 years old, sitting in her garden with dirt on my knees and an expression of complete satisfaction. She wrote the way she talked, directly, without decoration, with the specific warmth of someone who has decided that honesty is the most loving thing available. She wrote, "Lena, if you're reading this the way I intended, Harold found you. If you're reading it any other way, something went wrong that I tried to prevent. Either way, I need you to know what I know, because I've spent too many years watching you receive too little of what you were owed, and I am not willing to let that continue past my own death." I read that paragraph twice. The specific quality of being known posthumously, of having someone arrange from beyond their own life for the truth to reach you, is not something I have words precise enough for. It pressed on something behind my sternum that I kept very still and did not examine immediately, because I was a lawyer reading a document, and the document required my professional attention before it received my personal response. She wrote about the inheritance. She had set aside $340,000, accumulated over 40 years of careful saving, of investments she'd managed herself with the quiet competence of a woman who had never been given credit for being financially serious, of property she'd sold in 2018 and whose proceeds she'd placed in a dedicated account managed by Harold's firm. She had written the will with Harold's help 2 years before her death. During a period of full cognitive clarity, she had been careful to document, because she understood, and she wrote this explicitly, that her decision would not be popular with certain members of the family, and she wanted there to be no mechanism for challenging it. She had left the entire amount to me, not divided, not shared, mine. Her reasoning, written in the clear, specific language of a woman who had made her decision and was not apologizing for it. I have watched your parents invest in Vanessa's life and future in ways they have not invested in yours. I have watched them fund her business and her opportunities and her social position, while you built everything you have with your own hands and your own money, and without the support that should have been available to you as equally as it was available to her. I am not able to correct what they chose. I can correct what I choose. This is my correction." She wrote about Oliver. She had known I was pregnant before she died. I had told her in one of our Sunday phone calls, and she had said, without the 2-day silence and the managed disappointment, simply, "A baby. Lena, that's wonderful. Tell me everything." In the letter she wrote, "I will not meet him, which is the grief I am carrying into whatever comes next, but he will grow up knowing his great-grandmother thought his arrival was wonderful, because you will tell him so, and because I am leaving him the specific material evidence that someone in this family understood his mother's worth." I was on page 3 when my hands stopped being completely steady. I let them be unsteady for a moment. Harold Benson sat across from me, with the specific, respectful stillness of a man who understood that some documents needed to be received without witness commentary. Oliver breathed. The anteroom held its quiet around us, while the party continued its performance on the other side of the wall. Then I turned to page 4. I need to tell you something I should have acted on sooner, and I am sorry for the delay. 2 months before my death, I became concerned that the documents Harold had prepared were not secure. I had a conversation with your mother about the will. I told her its general terms, because I believed, wrongly, that transparency would produce acceptance rather than interference. Within 2 weeks of that conversation, Harold received a contact from an attorney I did not retain and did not recognize, questioning the will's execution on procedural grounds I did not understand. Harold handled it, but I want you to know it happened because I want you to know what to look for if things are not as they should be when you receive this. If you are receiving this letter from Harold in the normal course of estate administration, then the inheritance reached you as intended, and these concerns were unfounded. If you are receiving it some other way, at a party years late from an attorney who had to search for you, then the concerns were not unfounded, and you will need to do what you do better than anyone I have ever known. Read the documents carefully, follow the evidence, and trust what the numbers tell you. The child they ignored became the strongest one in the room. I have always known that. I need you to know I knew it. All my love. Always. Grandma Margaret. I folded the letter. I placed it in my bag with the specific, careful movements of someone handling a document that is going into evidence. I looked at Harold Benson. "Tell me what happened," I said. My voice was even. The lawyer voice, the one I used in depositions and courtrooms and difficult client conversations, the one that communicated that I was receiving information professionally and required precision rather than comfort. Harold had clearly been waiting for exactly that voice. He opened the leather folder on his knee. Margaret's will was executed correctly and witnessed properly 18 months before her death, he said. I filed it with the probate court in Cook County on the date of her death, as required. The estate entered the standard administration process. He paused. 6 weeks into administration, I received a competing document. A second will, dated 4 months before Margaret's death, executed by a different attorney, a man named Lawrence Webb, whose firm I was not familiar with. This second will divided the estate equally among all family members, including your parents and Vanessa, with no specific bequest to you. I looked at him steadily. 2 wills. 2 wills. The second predated the first by 14 months and should therefore have been superseded by Margaret's later document. However, the Webb will included a clause alleging that the later will, the one I executed, had been produced under undue influence. The allegation was that you had pressured Margaret into the bequest during a period of cognitive vulnerability. My jaw did the thing it does in cross-examination when a witness has just said something that the evidence will contradict. Not visible tightening, internal, the specific physical registration of a lawyer encountering a provable lie. Margaret had no cognitive vulnerability, I said. She was sharp until the end. She was, Harold said. I have her medical records confirming full decisional capacity at the time of both our estate planning sessions. I also have recordings of both sessions, with her explicit permission, in which she articulates her reasoning for the bequest in clear, consistent, detailed terms. He paused. The undue influence allegation had no evidentiary basis, but it was sufficient to trigger a probate dispute that froze the estate for 14 months while the competing claims were evaluated. And during those 14 months? The estate's liquid assets were held in a court-managed account. The investment account Margaret had designated specifically for your inheritance, the $340,000, was frozen pending resolution. Another pause, this one carrying the specific weight of what came next. 8 months into the freeze, I discovered that Lawrence Webb's firm had filed a motion requesting that the frozen account be transferred to a family-managed trust for administrative purposes during the dispute period. The motion was granted by a judge who did not have full visibility into the account's specific designation. I looked at Harold with the focused stillness of a lawyer who has just heard the load-bearing element of a case. "The money was moved," I said. "The money was moved," Harold confirmed, "into a family trust administered by your sister Vanessa as trustee." The anteroom was very quiet. Oliver breathed. The party on the other side of the wall produced its muffled, continuous performance. "I need to see the documents," I said. Harold opened the folder wider and placed it on the small table between us. If you've ever sat in a quiet room and watched the paper trail of something done to you get laid out in sequence, document by document, each one adding another layer to something you partially understood and are now understanding completely, drop a comment, because the next 40 minutes in that anteroom were exactly that kind of 40 minutes. The documentation was organized with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 50 years in estate law and understood that the difference between a case and a grievance was the quality of the paper behind it. Harold walked me through it in sequence. The original will, the competing document filed by Webb, the undue influence allegation and its specific, formulaic language, the language I noted with the professional attention of someone who had read hundreds of legal filings, of a document produced from a template rather than from specific factual knowledge. Whoever had drafted it had used standard undue influence language without the specific factual detail that a genuine allegation required. It was thin. It was designed not to win, but to delay. The motion to transfer the frozen account, the trust instrument establishing Vanessa as trustee, the court order granting the transfer. And then the bank records Harold had obtained through a subpoena that he'd filed 8 months ago, after his own suspicions had moved from professional concern to documented certainty. The $340,000 had entered the family trust on a Tuesday in March, 14 months ago. Over the following 6 months, it had left the trust in 11 separate transfers. Operational expenses, the transfer memo said, administrative fees, investment management costs. The destination accounts belonged to Vanessa's event planning business, my grandmother's inheritance, the correction she had made, deliberately and with documented clarity, for 34 years of family arithmetic that hadn't added up, had been systematically redirected into my sister's business operating account over 6 months in transfers small enough to avoid automatic scrutiny, with memo descriptions generic enough to survive a casual review. I sat with the bank records in my hands, and I did the thing I did with every document that contained information my client needed me to hold steadily. I read it completely, I understood it structurally, and I let the full weight of it settle, without flinching from any part of the weight. $340,000, 11 transfers, 6 months. My grandmother had written, "The child they ignored became the strongest one in the room." She had left me money. Someone had taken it, and the documentation of what had happened was sitting in a leather folder in the hands of a 72-year-old attorney who had spent 2 years finding the right moment to put it in mine. "You filed the subpoena 8 months ago," I said. "Why didn't you contact me then?" Harold looked at me with the expression of a man answering a question he's been asking himself. "I needed the documentation to be complete before I brought it to you. An incomplete case would have given your family time to obscure the remaining records. I needed everything before you knew everything, because once you knew, they would know you knew." He paused. "I also needed to find you. After Oliver was born, you moved apartments. It took me 3 months to locate your current address." I thought about the invitation, the cream envelope, my name in the serif font. "They invited me tonight," I said. "I know. I've been waiting for an occasion that would put you in the same room as your family and a sufficient number of witnesses." His expression carried the specific dry quality of a man who had spent 50 years watching human nature operate and had developed a professional appreciation for irony. Their 40th anniversary seemed adequate. I looked at him. "You've been planning this." "Margaret asked me to make it right," he said simply. "I've been making it right." I sat with that for a moment, the specific, settling weight of understanding that my grandmother had not only left me an inheritance and a letter, she had left me an attorney who had spent 2 years building the case to recover what had been taken. She had arranged, from beyond her own life, for the structure to hold. The documents went into my bag alongside the letter. I had photographed every page with my phone before Harold returned them to the folder, the automatic professional reflex of a lawyer who understood that originals needed to stay with the attorney and copies needed to be in multiple locations simultaneously. I stood up. Oliver shifted against my chest and resettled without waking, the specific, adaptable unconsciousness of a baby who trusts the person holding him. "The Webb attorney," I said. "Lawrence Webb. Do you have a connection between him and my family?" Harold reached into the folder one more time and produced a single page, a professional directory listing for Lawrence Webb, with a handwritten notation in Harold's margin. Webb's firm. Corporate client list includes Vanessa Carter Events LLC since 2019. Vanessa's business had been a client of the attorney who filed the competing will and the undue influence allegation. The attorney who had been retained, somehow, to challenge a will he had no legitimate connection to, whose client was my sister's company, a connection that should have required his recusal from any matter involving the family, had filed the documents that froze my inheritance and bought the 6 months needed to redirect it. I looked at the notation. I looked at Harold. "This is a conflict of interest," I said. "It is," Harold said. "It's also potentially evidence of coordinated fraud on the probate court, filing a legal challenge through an attorney with an undisclosed material conflict for the purpose of obtaining access to assets the challenging party had no legitimate claim to." He paused. "I've been in conversation with the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission for 4 months. They're aware of the Webb connection. They're evaluating the conduct." I nodded. Filed it. The specific professional filing of a lawyer, adding a piece to a case architecture that was becoming clearer with every document. "The anniversary speech," I said. "There's a program. My mother is giving remarks at 9 o'clock. Harold looked at his watch. "It's 8:15. "I know." I adjusted Oliver against my chest and picked up my bag. "I need 45 minutes. Harold stood. He looked at me with the expression I had come to recognize over the preceding hour as his baseline, the clear-eyed, patient assessment of a man who has done his part of the work and is watching the person he built it for decide what to do with it. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Be in the room at 9, I said, "with the folder." He nodded once. The nod of a man who has been waiting for this instruction for 2 years and finds it entirely satisfactory. I walked back toward the main hall. The party sounds grew louder as I approached the door. Glasses, music, the specific warm noise of an event at full performance. I pushed the door open. The photograph display lined the wall ahead of me. 40 years. Every face except mine. The specific, curated erasure of a family that had decided I didn't fit the frame. I walked past it without stopping. I had 45 minutes and a document set and the particular grounded clarity of a lawyer who has just finished reading the evidence and understands exactly what the case is. I found a corner table near the back of the room, and I sat down, and I opened my laptop. I kept it in my bag, the way I kept everything in my bag, because a lawyer is always either in court or preparing for court, and I began organizing what I had into the sequence it needed to be in. Oliver slept against my chest. Steady. Trustworthy. My grandmother had written, "Trust what the numbers tell you." I trusted the numbers. I started building the presentation. The woman at the table next to mine leaned over after a few minutes, mid-50s, warm-faced, the kind of person whose social instinct is toward connection rather than performance. She looked at Oliver with the specific, involuntary softness that sleeping babies produce in people. "He's beautiful," she said. "Thank you," I said without looking up from the screen. "Is he yours?" "Yes." A pause. Then, with the gentle curiosity of someone who has registered the laptop and the focused typing and the specific quality of concentration I was bringing to the task. "Are you working? At a party?" I looked up. I looked at her directly, with the expression I used when a deposition was going in a direction I needed to redirect. "I'm preparing closing arguments," I said. She blinked. "For what?" I looked back at my screen. "For this," I said. My mother took the microphone at 9 o'clock exactly. Lena Carter, at 61, had the specific polished composure of a woman who had spent 4 decades curating the story of her own life and had become, through practice and repetition, genuinely fluent in the performance of it. She stood at the front of the room in her anniversary dress, deep navy, selected with the intentionality of someone who understood that every public appearance was also a document, and she looked out at the room with the warm, practiced ease of a woman entirely at home in her own narrative. The room settled. 120 people with their champagne and their goodwill, and their 40 years of accumulated trust in the Carter family brand. I was at the back corner table with my laptop open and Oliver asleep against my chest, and 43 minutes of preparation completed. Harold Benson was standing near the side wall with his leather folder, exactly where I'd asked him to be. I closed my laptop. I listened. My mother spoke about 40 years the way a lawyer speaks about a favorable precedent, selectively, with confidence, emphasizing the elements that supported the conclusion she wanted the room to reach. She spoke about building a family, about sacrifice and commitment, and the specific rewards of choosing, every day, to invest in something larger than yourself. She spoke about her children, and here I noted, with the trained attention of someone who counts things, the specific distribution of her language. Vanessa received 4 sentences. Specific sentences: the business, the accomplishments, the pride. My mother's voice carried the particular warmth it reserved for subjects she considered reflective of her own good judgment. I received 1 sentence. "Our daughter Lena is also with us tonight." Then a pause, and the next sentence was about the guests who had traveled from out of town, also with us tonight. Not a name attached to an achievement, not a profession or a child or a life. A body present in a room, acknowledged with the minimum language required to avoid the appearance of omission. I sat with that sentence for a moment and I did the arithmetic. 34 years of also with us. 34 years of the sentence that acknowledged presence without weight, that placed me in rooms without placing me in the family's understanding of itself. I had a 3-month-old son sleeping against my chest. I had a wrongful termination case on my resume that had changed 3 children's financial futures. I had a law degree I'd funded with loans my parents hadn't offered to help with, built through years my sister had spent in a River North office on a below-market lease my father's connections had arranged. Also with us tonight. I looked at the photograph display one more time from across the room. 40 years of documented family history with a clean, consistent absence where I should have been. And I understood, with the specific finality of a thing that has been partially understood for a long time and has just been understood completely, what I had been inside this family's architecture. Not a member, not a daughter in the full sense of the word. Infrastructure, the person who could be called upon when the room needed filling and set aside when the frame needed to look clean. I had been the load that the structure used without acknowledging, the way a building uses its foundation without displaying it. That was the last moment I spent waiting for the family's arithmetic to correct itself. If you've ever been reduced to 1 sentence in a room full of people who knew better, drop a comment, because that moment at the back of the room was the moment I stopped being a daughter, waiting to be seen, and became a lawyer with a case. Here is what I had built in 43 minutes. Not a confrontation, not a speech designed to produce emotional reaction. A presentation, the specific, structured communication of a lawyer who understands that the most powerful thing evidence can do is speak plainly in a room full of people who have been told a different story. I had organized Harold's documentation into a sequence. The original will, Margaret's, correctly executed, properly witnessed, establishing the $340,000 bequest to me, specifically. The competing document, Webb's filing, thin and formulaic, with the undisclosed conflict of interest visible in the client relationship documentation Harold had provided. The court order transferring the frozen account to Vanessa's trust. The bank records, 11 transfers, 6 months, $340,000, moving from my grandmother's designated inheritance into my sister's business operating account. And one additional document I had built myself in the 43 minutes. A timeline. Clean, dated, each event in sequence. The specific visual architecture of a case presented so that a room full of non-lawyers could follow the logic without needing legal training. My grandmother writes her will. My mother is told its terms. A competing will appears, filed by an attorney whose firm represents Vanessa's business. The inheritance is frozen. The frozen account is moved to Vanessa's control. The money disappears into 11 transfers over 6 months. The timeline was 8 lines. It told a complete story in 8 lines. I had printed it on the venue's business center printer at 8:50, while my mother was greeting late arrivals, and Vanessa was refreshing her champagne, and Harold was taking his position by the side wall. I had 1 copy. It was enough. My mother was finishing her remarks. She was moving toward the toast. The champagne moment, the public confirmation of 40 years of the story she'd built, and the room was warming toward it with the specific anticipatory pleasure of an audience that knows the ceremony and is ready to complete it. I stood up. I did it the way I stand up in courtrooms when I'm about to address something that requires the room's full attention, not abruptly, not dramatically, with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it without apology. A few people near me noticed, then a few more. My mother saw me from the front of the room. Her expression did the micro-adjustment I'd seen at the entrance, the variable registering, the presentation recalibrating. "Lena," she said, with the specific warmth that was also a management tool. "Did you want to say something?" "Yes," I said. "I do." The room had the quality that rooms get when something unscripted enters a scripted occasion. Not hostile, not alarmed, simply alert. 120 people turning toward the variable. I walked to the front of the room. Harold moved toward the nearest display surface, a large monitor that had been showing anniversary photographs, and connected his laptop with the quiet efficiency of a man who had prepared for exactly this. I stood at the front of the room with Oliver against my chest and my printed timeline in my hand, and the specific, grounded steadiness of a person who has done the preparation and is now simply delivering what the preparation produced. "My name is Lena Carter," I said. "I'm the daughter who got 1 sentence in my mother's remarks tonight." The room was very still. "I'm also an attorney, and I've spent the last hour reviewing documentation that I think this room deserves to see." My father's expression went somewhere I didn't have a precise name for. Not rage. Rage would have been useful, would have been a response I could work with in real time. It was the expression of a man whose internal system has just received information that contradicts a load-bearing assumption and whose face is holding the shape of the previous state while the recalculation runs. My mother's champagne glass stopped moving. Vanessa, from her position near the bar, looked at Harold Benson's laptop connecting to the monitor and went very still in the specific way that people go still when they recognize a document they were not expecting to see displayed publicly. Harold's screen came up on the monitor. The original will, Margaret Carter's signature. Harold's witness signature. The date. My grandmother left me a specific inheritance, I said. $340,000, documented in a properly executed will, designated for me by name. The will includes a written explanation of her reasoning. I have that letter, and I'll read one line from it. I reached into my bag. I took out the letter. I found the line. She wrote, "I have watched your parents invest in Vanessa's life and future in ways they have not invested in yours. I am not able to correct what they chose. I can correct what I choose. This is my correction." The room was the specific silence of 120 people receiving information they are reorganizing their understanding around. Harold advanced to the next document, the web filing. 6 weeks after my grandmother's death, a competing will appeared, filed by an attorney named Lawrence Webb, alleging that I had exerted undue influence over my grandmother. I held up the client documentation. Lawrence Webb's firm has represented Vanessa Carter Events, LLC since 2019. He had a direct financial relationship with my sister and filed a legal challenge against a will that benefited me without disclosing that relationship. That's a conflict of interest. It's also currently under review by the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission. Vanessa set her champagne glass down, slowly, the specific careful movement of someone ensuring they don't make a sound. Harold advanced to the bank records. The legal challenge froze the estate for 14 months. During that period, the designated inheritance account was transferred to a family trust with my sister as trustee. I looked at the screen. Over the following 6 months, $340,000 left that trust in 11 transfers. The destination was Vanessa Carter, Events, LLC. I placed the printed timeline on the nearest table and stepped back from it. 11 lines. Clean, dated, complete. The room looked at it, at the monitor, at my sister near the bar, at my parents at the front of the room, standing in front of 40 years of photographs that included everyone except the daughter, currently holding the evidence. My mother's face had gone to the place I had watched my father's go. The expression of a structure whose load-bearing assumption has just been publicly identified as false. The composure was still there in its surface architecture. Underneath it, something had simply stopped. "I'm not asking for anything tonight," I said. "The legal process is already in motion." Harold Benson has been in contact with the appropriate authorities for months. The documentation is complete. I looked at the room, at the faces I recognized and the faces I didn't, all of them doing the specific human work of absorbing what they'd just been shown. "I came tonight because my family sent me an invitation," I said. "It turns out I had documentation to deliver. That felt like reasonable timing." I picked up my bag. Oliver stirred against my chest. He made the small sound he made when he was surfacing from deep sleep. Not distress, just the noise of a person adjusting to consciousness. I put my hand on his back. His breathing steadied. I looked at my grandmother's letter in my other hand. The handwriting on the envelope. My name, formed with the care of someone who understood that names mattered. I didn't look at my parents again. I had the evidence, and the timeline and my grandmother's letter and my son against my chest, and the specific, complete steadiness of a person who has delivered what they came to deliver and has somewhere better to be. I walked toward the exit. Harold Benson stood by the side wall as I passed him. He looked at me with the expression I had come to understand as his version of approval, restrained, precise, the professional satisfaction of a man whose case had just been presented to the correct audience in the correct sequence. "She would have been proud," he said quietly. I nodded. I kept walking. The door opened. The night received me. Chicago in October. Cool and indifferent and clean. The specific air of a city that has no investment in any particular family story, and will be here long after all of them. I stood on the venue steps for a moment. Oliver lifted his head from my chest and looked at the night with the wide, unguarded attention of a person encountering the world without any framework for what it's supposed to mean yet. He looked at the lights, at the dark sky, at the specific, particular everything of being 3 months old and awake and held by someone who was not going anywhere. I held him. I breathed. Behind me, the venue held its 120 people and its 40 years of photographs, and the specific, settling weight of a truth that had just been placed in the middle of a room that had been built to keep it out. I had been also with us tonight. I had also been the one with the evidence. Those two things had coexisted in the same room for one evening, and now the evening was over, and I was standing in the October air with my son and my grandmother's letter and the clean, unperformed relief of a person who has set down something heavy in exactly the right place. The arithmetic was complete. The numbers said what they said. I walked to my car. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, not dramatically, not in the satisfying single moment that stories prefer, but in the steady, procedural way of a system doing its work when the documentation is complete enough to require it. Harold filed the formal fraud complaint with the Cook County Probate Court 11 days after the anniversary party. The Illinois ARDC completed its review of Lawrence Webb's conduct 4 months later and suspended his license for 18 months. Conflict of interest, failure to disclose, conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. The specific dry language of professional accountability being administered without ceremony. Vanessa's business accounts were frozen during the civil recovery process. The event planning firm that my parents had seed funded and my father's connections had supported lost 3 major corporate contracts in the month following the anniversary, when the guest list, which had included several of those corporate partners, had the opportunity to reconsider their association. Reputation, it turns out, is also a financial instrument. It loses value under exactly the same conditions as other assets. The $340,000 was recovered in full, plus interest calculated from the date of the original diversion. Harold handled the recovery with the same methodical patience he'd brought to everything else. I received the funds on a Thursday morning. Wire transfer, standard confirmation email, the anticlimactic digital notification of something significant arriving through ordinary channels. I sat at my kitchen table with Oliver in his bouncer beside me, and I looked at the confirmation on my laptop screen, and I felt, not triumph, I want to be precise about this. I felt the specific, quiet completion of something my grandmother had set in motion and trusted me to finish. She had made a correction. I had ensured the correction reached its destination. That was the full account of it. I used the first $40,000 to cover 18 months of operating costs for a community center in Rogers Park, a neighborhood on Chicago's north side with a high concentration of single-parent households and a significant shortage of affordable childcare and legal aid resources. The center opened on a Saturday in March. I named it the Margaret Carter Community Center, which was not a dramatic decision or a sentimental one. It was the accurate one. The money was hers. The acknowledgement was hers. The remaining funds established an endowment that covered ongoing programming, legal aid consultations, childcare subsidies, financial literacy workshops for single parents navigating systems that were not designed with them in mind. I know what those systems feel like from the inside. I had navigated most of them alone, without the seed funding or the below-market lease or the social network introductions. The center was not a monument to what my family had failed to provide. It was a structure built from what my grandmother had chosen to provide instead,